Yeah, and we'll dig into some of the free agents as we continue on this offseason here on the 415ers podcast, brought to you by the Odyssey Sports Podcast Network with 95.7 The Game. Go follow Mark on social media at Mark Grandy, Mark with a C, Grandy with an I. I'm on social at eGiddings. Our podcast, you can find Twitter, Instagram, the rest at 415ers. Well, you mentioned some of the coaching additions, or in Philly's case, subtractions. Of course, you mentioned Jonathan Gannon going to Arizona, Shane Steichen going to Indianapolis. That fills the head coaching vacancies in the NFL. But the 49ers had another one of their coaches slip out. And of course, one of those vacancies was Houston. DeMeco Ryans got that. And we found out earlier this week that Bobby Slowick, the pass game coordinator this past year for San Francisco, had been an assistant coach for numerous years with the 49ers, is going to join him. So Kyle Shanahan, although he is the play caller, although he is the offensive mind and the guy that does everything, well, not necessarily everything, but everything starts with Kyle Shanahan, is going to have a void to fill, Mark. And I would kind of lean towards him filling it internally, but I guess you never really know because they went out and signed a defensive coordinator from outside the organization, which was something that they hadn't done in recent years.
Yeah, and they just keep losing assistant coaches, and Kyle Shanahan's cupboard is becoming a little bit barren at this point. And it's natural when you do have the success the Niners have had. This is what happens. Now it's on Kyle Shanahan to continue to identify, um, the next people in that line of great assistants that he's had that have gone on and had success elsewhere. So Bobby Slowick, who was only the passing game coordinator for the 49ers for 1 year last year. He was an offensive passing game specialist prior to that. He's the new offensive coordinator with the Texans, as you said. And now it's a question of who fills in there. It looks like a likely candidate is tight ends coach Brian Fleury. He's a guy that's well respected within the building for the 49ers that Kyle Shanahan really likes. And the tight end position, of course, because of George Kittle, and you got to credit Fleury for that as well, has always been a positive for the 49ers. So we'll see how he is able to do if the Niners do decide to give him a bigger role within the coaching staff. Um, but something that I'll keep an eye on, Evan, I know we talked about this. It was a couple of months ago, I think towards the end of the regular season, when when the DeMeco Ryans rumors were at its height, and Kyle Shanahan was essentially asked to reminisce about Mike McDaniel and DeMeco Ryans and even Robert Saleh and his recent assistant coaches, his recent coordinators that had gone on to be head coaches, and in DeMeco's case, would be going on to becoming a head coach soon. He was asked like how he thinks about team building specifically from a staff perspective. And he really, really loved and talked about the path that quality control coaches go through, QCs as he calls them, and how they have to really be up on everything because they're not a tight ends coach. They're not a running backs coach. They are focused on the entire team, not just one position. And as a result, those guys learn a lot more and are kind of better prepared to be coordinators or potentially head coaches at some point. So maybe more so than who gets promoted from a position coach to a coordinator spot or who becomes more trusted by Kyle Shanahan. I think I might be looking at who does he bring in from the outside? What young guy that we don't know about yet? What player just retired that Kyle Shanahan has identified as potentially a good coach in the future? What guys does he bring in that aren't yet in the organization? And who is filling those quality control spots? Because we have seen time and time again, those guys relatively quickly become household names and get promoted and leave the 49ers and have success elsewhere. So I might be keeping an eye on that. Maybe some names you haven't heard yet because you will probably know them before too long passes. So I do think Kyle Shanahan has proven he has an ability to identify those guys and to help, I don't know, nurture them and to help them grow and they become good coaches. So I'm not too worried about it, but it will be interesting to see how Kyle Shanahan does try to tackle this problem because, as I said, his assistant coaching room is becoming it's been scavenged by teams from around the league. So we'll see how he does bounce back from that now.
Well, he's been able to bounce back before. I mean, he's lost some quality candidates, some quality coordinators, some quality assistant coaches in years past, and he's continued to chug along. And I think we both agree he's had his best season as head coach, even if he wasn't named the head coach of the year, which we might discuss a little bit later in the episode. Um, Two things off of that, Mark. Number one, I think that Kyle Shanahan has shown that he values also versatility. And that is something I'm not saying Flory is going to get, the fill the void of Slowick immediately. He's going to be the next guy up, but someone like him. And what I mean by that is a guy like, Brian Flory, he also isn't just an offensive mind. In fact, the majority of his background is on the defensive side of the football with other organizations. In Miami, he worked closely with the DCs. Before that, he also worked as an outside linebackers coach and now has sort of shifted to the offensive side of the football. In college, he was a quarterback at Townsend. Like, there are a lot of different skill sets that I think Kyle Shanahan values in not only his coordinators, but in general, his assistant coaches and his position coaches to be able to understand all sides of the football. So I think that's one where we're seeing Kyle Shanahan maybe not be ahead of the curve, but at least emphasize versatile positions under him so that if one day he does need to elevate guys, that he feels comfortable doing so. The second thing that is on my mind, Mark, which we won't know, but I'm curious and we'll pay attention to is these young head coaches. Like Shane Steichen hired age 37. Obviously, Sean McVay was the youngest head coach when he was hired with the Rams. Kyle Shanahan, very close to that in his late 30s. I am curious how the assistant coach and coordinating rooms will continue to be filled by these young head coaches after their sort of immediate relationships fade away. And what I mean by that is Kyle Shanahan obviously has experience with the Browns, with the Texans, with the Falcons, and now with the 49ers. But his relationships is where we see him draw from a lot of his coaching staff. And as, of course, he continues to filter guys in and out, and Kyle Shanahan doesn't have as long of a coaching resume, which is a credit to him. That's how brilliant he is, but doesn't have as long of a coaching resume as someone taking over in their 40s or their 50s and being able to grow as a guy like, I don't know, for example, Doug Peterson has kind of a wider well to pick from when it comes to selecting his coaching staff. As those coaches for Shanahan continue to dry up, I am curious what means he will go to in order to fill those spots, just because he probably doesn't have, and maybe this is being assumptuous, but probably doesn't have as long of a list as someone who is an older head coach and has been around the game a lot longer than he has.
That's a good point. I hadn't considered that angle of it because you're right. A lot of the guys that have been on his staff are guys he's run into maybe by chance or happenstance at previous coaching stops, or maybe even from days in college, people he knew through his dad. And the more you pick from that list, the fewer names remain on that list. I think it's probably on Kyle Shanahan, and I'm sure he's aware of that as well. He can read the writing on the wall. It's probably at that point up to Kyle Shanahan over the last number of years to continue developing those relationships and keeping an eye out for people outside of your building that you like. And maybe you don't quite have, I don't know, the great personal relationship that say he had with Mike McDaniel, where they were together on basically every one of Kyle Shanahan's coaching stops before the 49ers, including the 49ers, of course, but before them as well, when he wasn't a head coach. Probably doesn't have that kind of relationship with some of these guys, but I'm sure there are guys, there are players, there are people that he has probably identified as, hey, I might be interested in bringing you on as a coach whenever you're ready. And I know there was one example he went up to a player, I think after practice one day, and said, hey, you might not be cut out for this playing thing, unfortunately. You're not going to get much playing time for us, but I would love you to be, a quality control coach on our staff whenever you're ready. And the player like stormed off and eventually came back the next day or a couple days later and said, "I was pissed, Kyle. I'm not gonna lie, but I think I want to be a coach for you." And I don't think he specified what player that was, but he ultimately joined the staff, and I think Kyle Shanahan was happy about that. So I think that's where those sorts of things come into play, where it's up to Kyle Shanahan to lean on relationships he's built outside of the organization while he's been a 49er head coach. And that's why it's important to never burn bridges, to not do any other organization wrong, because you never know who you might be upsetting and if you might be asking someone to do something to help you in the future. So I think Kyle Shanahan has been aware of that, and it's probably what we'll see put into action over the next couple of years. Because you're right, he's got to be running a little bit dry on his list of guys that he knows personally, that he has worked with personally from his time before San Francisco, because that was a handful of years ago now.
Yeah, and I do think this is where we can see the evolution of Shanahan, perhaps not publicly, but certainly as a head coach, because you're going to have to be more trusting. Like the one advantage that he does have is, of course, he has built up the reputation of being someone that, number one, if you're a young upcoming head coach, is going to get you hired. You're
Yeah.
going to have a job if you succeed in San Francisco somewhere else, and you're probably going to be in the NFL for a very long time. So he's got that going for him. The second part is he's also built up a reputation of being in a very educated, intelligent football mind that other people would love to learn from, even if that doesn't equate to a job at a higher level. So he has that sort of magnetism surrounding him, I believe, as a coach over, I don't know, maybe 80 to 90% of head coaches in football, perhaps even more with how young he is. And so he's going to have, in a way, I think, a little more pick of the litter from coordinators or assistant coaches that, like you're talking about. The question is, how trusting can he be and how quickly can he assimilate those guys into his system? Because as we know, Kyle Shanahan is a very much direct, not necessarily my way or the highway, but is going to tell you what you need to hear, not necessarily what you want to hear, and is going to make sure that it is done on his watch. So there's a lot of things that we're going to be keeping in track of, and I think that this, maybe not, exactly this specific hire is going to indicate what way he's going, but it's something to keep an eye on if San Francisco continues to succeed, because in all likelihood, Mark, that means they're going to continue to lose top-notch coaching candidates.
Yeah, one other thing that you just said that kind of got my brain working was, for a number of reasons. I think one reason you might have left off is the Niners are a well-run organization and they're successful. People want to be here, whether or not it's Shanahan as the head coach. I think people want to be here for that reason as well.
Well,
Uh,
I would push back a little bit and just point you towards the years before Shanahan and after Harbaugh, and ask you if they were as well of a run organization then as they are now.
True, but that is, you're right. That is an era of some dysfunction for the 49ers, but I think it's pretty clear that ownership, Jed York, has learned from that, and you can't argue that he has been a much better owner the last 6 7 years than he was the 7 years prior to that. So I do understand your point. I do think the relatively recent history suggests that this is a place that's pretty good to be at. Um, but the other thing that you said is Shanahan might, have pick of the litter for guys. I think you're generally right that, again, people want to play for Kyle Shanahan, and people don't mind being a San Francisco 49er for the most part. However, I do think Shanahan generally, of course, he would want pick of the litter, and he always wants the best guy. But kind of what I was getting at earlier, I think he kind of likes finding those unknown guys and developing them into someone like a DeMeco Ryans or like a Robert Sala. He doesn't like going out and hiring, the number one name. He's your next great defensive coordinator. Obviously, he would love to have that, and he wants to have the best defensive coordinator possible. But I think he's almost more intrigued by finding someone young that he has some connection with, that is confident in, and running him through the ranks, and in a few years churning out a great defensive coordinator, a great offensive mind, the next Mike McDaniel, the next DeMeco Ryans. I almost feel like he enjoys that process more so than just going out there and saying, all right, everyone agrees this is the number one defensive coordinator for this offseason. Come to San Francisco. You are our new DC. He would obviously love a great defensive coordinator. I'm not saying he wouldn't be willing to do that, but I think he almost prefers that long process of finding, developing a young guy and helping turn him into the next great defensive coordinator, a la Robert Saleh and a la DeMeco Ryans. Maybe I'm getting a little too, I don't know, positive of Kyle Shanahan, too complimentary of Kyle Shanahan, but I think he enjoys that process.
No, I don't think you are, Mark. And before we move on to our final topic, I do want to say this. It sounds an awful lot like the quarterback conversation surrounding Kyle Shanahan, because what do people continue to say about Kyle? Well, he doesn't actually want the number one star. He doesn't want to get the most dynamic, biggest, best quarterback in the league. He'd rather develop a Matt Ryan or develop kind of an average, a Kirk Cousins or a Matt Stafford. He'd rather have those guys run his offense and be the guy to find the hidden gem or unearth the talent that was previously unlocked. And it's just funny that the way that we're talking about coaches is the way that I feel like a lot of people talk about Shanahan, a relationship to his quarterback. So
Yeah.
maybe there's some correlation there.
Yeah, you might be right. I think maybe the difference is he would love to have one of those elite quarterbacks. He doesn't care where it comes from, just lock him up for a handful of years and never have to worry about that position again. But I do get what you're saying. That is, there are some parallels there, I'll say.
We can have that conversation another day. I think it's a long one and one that we can dig into in the off season for sure.